Everyone, my name is Zachary Gersten. I'm the technical manager for this parallel session, which is entitled, as you can see on the slide, Aquatic and Animal Source Foods, and it's chaired by Dr. Gina Kennedy. So thank you so much for taking part in ANH 2021, and we look forward to a really robust and interactive session today. Just a really quick reminder that everything that you might need to access the conference materials, so the program, the links, and everything can be found on the ANH Academy website, which is anh-academy.org/ANH2021. And before Dr. Kennedy takes the conversation forward, I have a few technical announcements to ensure our experience is as smooth and as interactive as possible. So first, this session is going to be recorded, or is being recorded, and will be posted on the ANH Academy website after the conference. Second, all of you have been muted upon entry into the Zoom room, but we really want you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and maybe what organization you represent or work with. We encourage you to share your webcam video feed during the session, but if your connection's bad or something, you definitely turn it off and have full agency to do that. Later on in the session, we'll open up the conversation with a Q&A period. And so if you have questions, you can go ahead and paste them in the chat. We'll be monitoring those throughout the session, and then re-raise them during the Q&A session at the end to not address prior. And then if you do experience any technical issues, just double check your audio and your internet connection first. The second step would be just to log off and log right back in. You can use the exact same Zoom link and password. And then if you have any other issues, feel free to send me a direct chat in the chat box. So I think that's it. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our chair. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Zachary, and welcome to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining this parallel session on aquatic and animal source foods. As Zach said, my name is Gina Kennedy, and I work for USAID Advancing Nutrition, the Director of Food Systems with that multi-sectoral nutrition project. So, so glad you could join us. We have a really exciting panel of speakers for you today. They're all going to be speaking on the role of aquatic and animal source foods to improve nutrition, food security, income, and food safety. Their research abstracts include a range of geographies. There's a special emphasis on Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Tanzania, and very interesting demonstration of different research methods and techniques. Some less well known, at least to me as a public health nutritionist, some economic experiments on willingness to pay and willingness to accept paying more for safe food, particularly fish, and a systematic literature and policy reviews on aquatic food resources, and then also use of the World Bank's Living Standard and Measurement Survey in Tanzania to analyze animal source food consumption patterns over time. So really interesting mix of geographies and research methods. And then what else is exciting about this session is very timely. So pleased that ANH decided to accept this session on aquatic and other animal source foods, because the 2021 World Food Prize is going to be awarded to a leading nutrition expert, Dr. Shakuntala Thilsted, for her achievements in pioneering fish-based food systems to improve nutrition, health, and livelihoods for millions around the world. So many of us know Shakuntala. She actually does work at World Fish, where many of our speakers are also affiliated. And she's known for her groundbreaking work on small indigenous fish species and the contribution of those small indigenous fish to nutrition, women's income, and women's empowerment. And the other reason why this session is timely really is that this year will be the UN Food System Summit. The Food System Summit is part of the Decade of Action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And it's really, they call it a people summit. So that means that there's a lot of ways to be involved now. There's a lot of forums that you can join. There's a lot of ways you can participate in different action tracks or or join a food system summit dialogue, or host your own food system summit dialogue. So it's a way really that we can work together across sectors, geographies, and perspectives to think about how we transform the way the world produces, consumes, and thinks about food. So it's being called a summit for everyone, everywhere, a people summit and a solution summit. So it's very timely to have this session that precedes those two very important events. So with that background in mind, I'm really pleased to introduce our 4 speakers. They will speak for 8 minutes each, and then we'll have a Q&A. So should you have a question for one of them in particular, please type your question into the chat and say this question is for name, Kelvin or Costanza, and so on. If it's for all of them or just a general question, you can just say in parentheses, all or general. And we have Zach and others who will be keeping track of your questions, and we'll try and get through them in the Q&A. But first, we'll run through all the 4 speakers who are Kelvin Shikuku from World Fish, Constanza Gonzalez from 3IE, Jacqueline Xia from World Fish, and Nguyen Tran, also from World Fish. So without taking up any more time, I will pass the floor to Kelvin Shikuku, our first speaker, who's going to speak on expectations-based reference dependence and the demand for fish food safety certification, experimental evidence from Nigeria. Kelvin, floor is yours.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Gina, for the nice introductions. My name is Kelvin Shikuku. I work with Wellfish. I am an economist, and as Gina mentioned, I'm going to be talking about an experiment that we've conducted in Nigeria with a team of co-authors listed here. Who include Erwin Bulte, Karl-Johan Lagerqvist, and Nguyen Tran. And so this work focuses on the role of expectations, based reference dependence on consumer demand for fish food safety certification. And so I'm going to be, showing you how reference dependence and expectations influence consumer demand for food safety. So let me give a bit of background. So we know that minimizing potential health hazards within food producing sectors is crucial for human nutrition security. And we also know that low and middle income countries in Southern Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa account for the largest share of foodborne diseases, related deaths. And we also know that, given these 2 points I mentioned, it therefore follows that interventions targeted to these particular regions, namely South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, are required, for reducing vulnerability to foodborne diseases. Now, one of the options that have been identified and is increasingly recognized is certification for food safety. But information about consumer demand for food safety certification in developing countries, particularly in the domestic markets, is not known, or is rather scant. And so the objectives of this study, therefore, are twofold. One is to assess the effect of endowments as reference points on consumer evaluation for fish food safety certification, and secondly, to assess the effect of expectations on consumer evaluation for fish food safety certification. So very quickly about the experiment design, we implement a factorial design in Nigeria's fish markets. So we basically endow participants either with 500 grams of uncertified live catfish or 500 grams of certified catfish. And then we vary the probability that they would have a chance to trade the endowment for another commodity. So if you are endowed with the uncertified fish, you have a probability either high or low to switch to a higher quality product, in this case, the certified fish. And similarly, if you have a certified fish product, you get a chance either high or low to ask for compensation to downgrade to a low quality product. And so basically you can think of it as we're asking how much premiums are people willing to pay either to upgrade to a quality product, and how much would you ask in as a compensation in order for you to accept, to downgrade. And so, in 6 steps, this is how the experiment looks like. So first participants receive the endowment, and they also given information about the fish products, right? So you are told about which one, whether you have a certified or not certified product, and also you are provided information about the probability of switching, right? So that is in step 2, where we now randomly assign people either probability either high or low that they can be able to exchange. Now in step 3, we ask participants to answer a few questions, and this is basically to allow the information that we've told the participant to sink in, or in other words, we allow the reference points to form. Now in step number 4, we now elicit willingness to pay to upgrade, like I said, in the first arm. In the second arm, we elicit willingness to accept to downgrade. Then in step number 5, in step number 4, basically we use the de Groot-Marshak bidding mechanism to elicit those willingness to pay and willingness to accept. In step number 5, participants complete another survey. This time we ask about, a few demographic questions. And we also ask some Likert scale questions, which help us to tell a little bit what are people's aspirations to, towards, food safety certification. And I'll come back again, you'll see in the results some interesting findings from these Likert scale questions. And then in the end, we roll a 10-sided dice, okay, to basically determine whether you have a 10% chance or 90% chance, right? So depending on the outcome of the dice, so for example, if it turns out a 9, then you have a 90% chance. If it turns out, if it turns out a number, less than, greater than 9, then you have 90% chance. If it turns, a number only 1, then you have only 10% chance, okay? And so we determine that through rolling a dice in step number 6. So this is how it looks in practice. We have our team here in the field. We have our, you can see there the dice. And also to explain the idea of chance so that people can understand, and for us to minimize, game misperception, we also have this, we show people combinations of the black and white balls so that they can be able to understand what we mean by, 90% or 10% chance, okay? So for us to estimate, therefore, the effects of endowment and expectations, we estimate this model here. So where we regress the bids that people submit, we regress those on the experiment dummy. So whether you are assigned in the first experiment, in the first arm, willingness to pay, or the second arm, willingness to accept. Trade here measures whether you are assigned, it's 1 if you are assigned a 90% chance and 0 otherwise. And then we interact that with with the certification dummy, and so that basically then helps us also to understand the effect of expectations in the second arm. Okay, and then we control for people's demographic characteristic that's determined by X, and also we control for the market fixed effects that's determined by the C. So now turning to results, we see here that generally we find that people are willing to upgrade. People bid significantly to upgrade, and also people ask for a lot as a compensation to downgrade. And so what is striking here is you see that the willingness to accept is 43% higher than willingness to pay. So in other words, people are demanding higher compensation to give up a certified fish that was given to them compared to how much people are willing to pay to upgrade from uncertified to certified fish. So again, telling us that really people anchor on the endowment, and that therefore endowment effects affect consumers' behavior. Now, here is another finding which I would like to draw your attention to these places where I have arrows. So this part and that part. And what you can see here is that there's a sort of reverse endowment effect. What do I mean by that? You see that the willingness to accept arm, number 2, it doesn't stochastically dominate the willingness to pay arm. At least at these lower levels of bids, we see that willingness to pay is higher than willingness to accept. So it seems at these particular, lower levels, people bid more to upgrade than people are asking for compensation. So in other words, you can also think there was a subsample of a population that of a population that asked for quite low bids to accept to downgrade. And the other feature here is that you see quite a number of people in the willingness to accept arm. They ask for quite a lot of money, which is 400 naira for them to be able to give up the fish. So the data is highly censured. And so that then comes here where we then not only estimate ordinary least squares regression, but because of the censured nature of our data, we also estimate a 2-bit regression to account for that censuring. And so what we see here, we first of all notice that people that were endowed so endowment first of all matters. So people endowed with the certified product, you can see, that has a significant effect on the bids that people submit. The other thing that you may note here is that, and particularly in column 3 and column 4, is that we find that expectations matter in some domains and not others, right? So expectations matter when people are upgrading from a low, from uncertified fish to certified fish, but expectations don't matter when people are asked to downgrade. So it means basically people anchor very strongly on the certified fish that no matter how much chance you give them to downgrade, they don't want to downgrade. They don't want to give up that fish. So that's the finding that you get here. So for example, if you took the difference between the coefficient 0.45 and 0.44, you notice that is going to be quite small. I mean, if you added the sum of those. So, and then very quickly here, what do we see? Remember I said we asked people about some Likert scale questions. It's very interesting that in the willingness to pay.
Sorry to interrupt you, Kelvin, but 8 minutes has passed.
Okay, 1 second. I think this is.
Yes, please wrap up.
Okay. So what I was highlighting here is that just the same way in willingness to pay, people say they spent a lot of time thinking about the certified fish instead of thinking about what they have, is exactly also what you see in the in the second arm, that people think strongly about the certified product. And so just to conclude, consumers are not willing to give up. Consumers are not willing to are not only willing to upgrade from uncertified to certified fish, but they also are unwilling to abandon the certified fish once they are once adopted. And we conclude that increasing availability of safety certified fish in the domestic markets would reduce uncertainty in the supply of such products, and therefore increasing the likelihood of consumers being able to purchase the product when needed. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kelvin, for that really interesting research on consumers' willingness to upgrade and willingness to downgrade. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. Please put your questions for Kelvin into the chat, and we will take them once all the speakers have gone. So our second speaker is Constanza Gonzalez. She is with 3IE. Constanza is going to be talking about aquaculture for improving productivity, income, nutrition, and women's empowerment in low and middle income countries based on a systematic review and meta-analysis. The floor is yours, Constanza.
Sorry, I was having issues finding the right buttons. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, and I can see you, and I can see your slides.
And you can see my slides. Perfect. Great. So hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Constanza Gonzalez, a research associate at 3IE. And I'm going to present the systematic review on the effectiveness of aquaculture interventions. Right. So the systematic review had 5 broad research questions related to the effectiveness of aquaculture interventions in low and middle income countries. related to the barriers and facilitating factors affecting these interventions and cost effectiveness of these interventions. But I'm going to focus today on the first question only. So do aquaculture interventions increase the productivity, income, nutrition, and empowerment of individuals engaged in aquaculture? So we framed the review under a theory of change. This is a simplified version of that, to show what we expected on the pathways for these interventions. So the most straightforward channel for these interventions was for them to aim to increase either the productivity or income of the participants. So we aim to include interventions that would not only focus on, say, production technology, but also try to focus on efficiency of the value chain, the whole value chain. So that would also include access to training, access to input, better access to the market itself, and so on. So this was the main pathway for the review, in the sense that we expected that the majority of the interventions would include somehow these pathways. However, we also acknowledge that the aquaculture interventions could also have other social objectives, and we focus specifically on nutrition and women's empowerment. And then we frame these pathways as additional components, and that's what you see in the dashed lines. So now, right. So now moving on to talk about the inclusion criteria. I'm not going to go through the whole inclusion criteria of what we were looking for in the literature search, in the systematic search. But just to highlight that we had a broad criteria in every sense, except in terms of the study design. So that's where we mainly, that's our major restriction. So we only focus on impact evaluations, rigorous impact evaluations that had either experimental or quasi-experimental design. And that's because we wanted to talk about effectiveness, so we needed rigorous studies. This is a summary of our review process. So we started with almost 12,000 records. We screened at full text almost 200. And I want to point out, hopefully you can see here when I'm hovering with the mouse. I just want to highlight that number. We excluded 70 studies because of their study design. And this is something that we want to come back later on. We ultimately included 21 studies covering 13 different aquaculture interventions. Here you can see a map of where these interventions are. And you can see that Bangladesh, as was mentioned in the introduction, is the hotspot in this review. It's where at least half of the studies are focused on. This is a huge table presenting more information, more details on these 13 programs. But I do want to point out two things. One is that the most common components of these interventions was that they provided training and technology somehow, right? And as expected, all of these interventions included a component focused on either productivity or income. But only a few of them, and you can see here in the last columns, only a few of them had explicit objectives of related to either nutrition or women's empowerment. So related to the meta-analysis, the quantitative synthesis, the first stage for this is that we conducted a risk of bias assessment. So we look at the quality of each of the included studies. And the question is the study free from this bias? And here you can see the chart, different domains of bias, right? And because of how the question is framed, we would want to see answers as yes or probably yes. So we would want to see greens in these charts. And this is the case for several domains, bias domains, but we also see a lot of kind of this yellowish color. There's several studies where we didn't have enough information to make an informed decision of whether the study was conducted in a way to avoid those bias. Then we created a category of the overall risk of bias for each study. And 2 studies were assessed as having low risk of bias. 8 studies had some concerns, and 12 studies, so at least half of all of the included studies, had an overall high risk of bias. This is something to consider when we go through their results as well. So the second component of the quantitative synthesis is that we extracted data to compare and to estimate average effects. And we conducted meta-analysis where studies measured sufficiently similar outcomes. And we also did some moderator analysis, including study design characteristics, intervention characteristics, location, and risk of bias, and so on. So we're going to go through like a very high-level summary of the effectiveness results, mapped to the theory of change graph that we saw previously. So first, you can see that for the pathways of productivity and income, you can see like this thick colored arrows. That's the way for us to show that we found evidence on these pathways. Oops, I'm going backwards. And here you can see this table, the outcomes that were measured but different in these two groups. In the last column, you can see the number of programs that measured these outcomes. And in these cases, for these two groups, it goes from 1 to 10. And the outcomes that are like within the boxes, the blue boxes, are the ones that are statistically significant. So in this case, we found that on average, aquaculture interventions had a positive effect on the production value, on the income of participants, and on household expenditure. Secondly, we can see that the arrows pointing to the nutrition box are getting a little bit thinner, are losing a little bit of color, and that's our way to show that we found reduced evidence around, rigorous evidence around nutrition outcomes. And similarly, similar table, you can see the outcomes that were measured. We can see that between 1 and 3 studies measured these nutrition outcomes, and we only found a positive statistically significant effect on fish consumption. Third, you can see that now the arrows related to women's empowerment are almost invisible, and that's our way to show that just a few studies, rigorous impact evaluations, measured outcomes on women's empowerment. 3 programs, again, only measured this type of outcomes, but this time, these outcomes were too different, so we weren't able to synthesize them quantitatively. And they showed generally mixed results, in part because they were measuring different things. So, yeah. So just a few takeaway key issues and implications. So there seems to be a paucity of impact evaluations of aquaculture interventions, but not necessarily of aquaculture programs, right? So we excluded 70 studies because of their study design. This study covered other 21 countries where aquaculture programs are or had been implemented. And that's an example of how the lack of evidence is on rigorous impact evaluations, not of programs themselves. And within the set of included studies, we also found several challenges related to the way the outcomes were reported, the lack of disaggregated data to conduct subgroup analysis, the fact that outcomes were measured in few studies the results are not quite representative of the whole range of programs that we included. And this points out to the fact that we didn't include sufficient information to fully address all our research questions related to effectiveness, and something similar happened to our questions of barriers and facilitators and cost effectiveness. So just to close, one takeaway message is it seems like the aquaculture sector would really appreciate and welcome more impact evaluations, rigorous impact evaluations, to know the effectiveness of these programs, and also promotion of reporting standards to also make it more easy to compare between these programs. And my last slide is just to remind you that we have this development evidence portal where you will be able to find not only this systematic review when it's published, but all of their included studies and a whole range of impact evaluations, evidence gap maps, and systematic reviews on the development sector. So if you don't know it yet, I invite you to take a look. Thank you, and back to you, Gina.
Great. Thank you so much, Costanza, for that excellent presentation. Very interesting and a lot for us to think about in terms of designing our research to have evidence of better impact. Really, really fascinating. Thank you. So we'll move on to our third speaker, Jacqueline Shea. She's also from World Fish, and she's going to be speaking about nutrition-sensitive aquaculture in Bangladesh, success with policies, and challenges with implementation. The floor is yours, Jacqueline.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Jackie Shea. I am a Mickey Leland International Hunger Fellow working with World Fish. And today I'm going to present some of our policy research work focused on nutrition-sensitive aquaculture in Bangladesh, success with policies, challenges with implementation. So just a little background on what motivated this policy research. As you may know, Bangladesh has experienced a rapid growth in aquaculture production in the last 2 decades. And at the same time, Bangladesh has made significant progress in tackling undernutrition, but micronutrient deficiencies are still high and there is a growing burden of overnutrition and obesity. So this all provides a timely opportunity to promote nutrition-sensitive aquaculture. Understanding the policy landscape for nutrition-sensitive aquaculture, meaning both what existing policies are out there and also how these policies are being implemented, are imperative in ensuring that policies and the programs that these policies are translated into are contributing to continued nutrition progress in Bangladesh. Just to briefly go over a few key definitions, when we're referring to nutrition-sensitive aquaculture, we mean activities that target the underlying determinants of malnutrition. So for example, activities that improve food security or water sanitation and hygiene. Another concept we focus on in this research is the enabling environment for nutrition, which is defined as the wider political and policy processes which build and sustain momentum for the effective implementation of actions that prevent or reduce malnutrition. So for this study, we were interested in 2 main research questions. First, how nutrition sensitive are existing national policies? And second, how are these existing national policies being translated into program implementation, both at the national and subnational levels? So to answer our first research question, we used FAO's key recommendations for nutrition-sensitive agriculture, and we applied that to aquaculture. And to answer our second research question, we conducted 14 key informant interviews from relevant ministries, NGOs, international agencies, and researchers or experts across nutrition and aquaculture-related sectors. So first, I'll go over the results of the policy review. Again, here we were interested to know how nutrition-sensitive policies are. So this figure shows all the policies we assessed and how they scored against FAO's key recommendations. Briefly, the dark green cells indicate the full presence of each recommendation, light green cells indicate the partial presence, and white cells indicate the complete absence of each recommendation. As you can see, 13 of the 15 FAO key recommendations were included in at least one of the 8 policy documents analyzed. This is a positive finding, which suggests that overall national policies are pretty comprehensive and pretty nutrition sensitive. So breaking down some interesting findings, we found that production diversification was the most frequently mentioned recommendation. And on the other hand, capacity building for nutrition human resources was included in only one policy document. And the second country investment plan here was the most nutrition sensitive policy document containing 83% of the recommendations. And then when we disaggregated further by policy document type, so whether it was nutrition related or aquaculture related, we found that more of FAO's recommendations were present in nutrition policy documents at 62% compared to aquaculture policy documents at 31%. And you can see this pretty clearly in the figure where most of the dark green cells are here on the nutrition policy document side. So now I'll go over the findings from the key informant interviews. Again, here we were interested in how nutrition sensitive aquaculture policies are being implemented. So participant perspectives fell under 3 broad themes: governance, policy implementation, and human and financial capacity. In general, participants described certain technical and structural challenges within these three themes, which they perceived to constrain the effective translation of nutrition-sensitive aquaculture policies into actual action. So in terms of governance, participants highlighted that there has been effective multi-sectoral collaboration and coordination when it comes to policy formulation specifically. But despite the existence of these good governance structures, participants still describe numerous challenges in implementing nutrition-sensitive activities intersectorally. So participants explained that there are certain disincentivizing factors, such as the perception from non-health ministries that nutrition is an additional time burden and out of the scope of their mandates. And this actually hindered the effective cross-sector collaboration and coordination. There's also a clear incongruence between national and subnational actors. Just to give one example, one participant explained that activities at the subnational level were often impeded by the fact that decisions had to go through the national level first. In terms of implementation, participants cited increased production as the main nutrition-sensitive aquaculture activity. They also noted an increasing recognition of the use of polyculture because of the nutritional benefits of small indigenous species fish. Some participants noted that because of this widespread success in production, now the focus should really be placed on growing issues such as food safety, post-harvest handling and storage, as well as value chain addition. And notably, some participants emphasize that fish production gains have not been experienced by poorer and smallholder farmers. They explained that the inability to own land or ponds and limited access to formal credit institutions were some key factors that drove these inequities. In terms of capacity, almost all participants across all sectors discussed the limited manpower of the fishery sector specifically, particularly at the union level, resulting in less coverage of nutrition-sensitive extension activities. Insufficient funding and investments was also highlighted as a key barrier to implementation. So now putting all of the results together, both policy content and implementation, we found that production diversification and the promotion and conservation of small indigenous fish species were strong, both in policy content and in implementation. We also found that there are strong policies for food safety, as well as across and within sector collaboration, but these policies were not necessarily being implemented to the fullest extent or effectively. And lastly, we found that vulnerable populations and women's empowerment is being overlooked, both in content and in implementation. So to conclude, our findings highlight that nutrition-sensitive aquaculture policies in Bangladesh are relatively comprehensive, and this suggests that an enabling policy environment for aquaculture to support nutrition gains exists. However, there are certain disenabling governance, politics, capacity, and financing environment, which is hindering the translation of these policies into effective action. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Jacqueline, for that really interesting research on policy and the difference between what we have written in the books and how we implement it. It's really fascinating. I thought you did a really nice systematic job. So lots of great information there for us to think about in terms of how do we get better with implementing our good policies that we've created. So we have one final speaker, Nguyen Tran. He's with World Fish, and he is going to be speaking about his research looking at spatial and temporal patterns of consumption of animal source foods in Tanzania. Nguyen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gina. I'm going to share my screen.
Yes, I can see him.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Nguyen Tran. I work for One Fish as scientist. I'm an agriculture applied economist, but also with an interdisciplinary background on aquaculture and fisheries. So in this presentation, I will talk about animal source food patterns of animal source food consumption in Tanzania, and using descriptive statistics and econometric methods. So basically, animal source foods are important source of micronutrients for vulnerable population in developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And we know there's a rapid transformation in terms of animal source food consumption in these developing regions. However, actual data and information in terms of metrics are quite limited. So, for example, if we look into the fish consumption, there's very limited study to understand how the consumer behave and what kind of preferences they have for fish, and likewise the same for animal products. And given the rapid transformation in food system and urbanization and other factors, there's rapid changes, and this gives us impetus for investigating this study. And we believe that the study we carry out here are important to inform policy and decision makings, to guide interventions how to transform animal source food systems to meet nutrition and food security and other policy targets. So the objectives of this study, as I mentioned, there are two objectives. The first one is we assess patterns of changes in animal source food consumption in households in Tanzania. And that second is we use econometric method to estimate the price and expenditure elasticities of animal source food demand in Tanzania. And the reason why we focus in Tanzania is Tanzania is one of the countries in East African regions where there's also high aquatic foods, high diverse aquatic food system, and particularly we look into the Great Lake regions. And then also there's a poor country with low income, and many donors identify Tanzania as one of the countries need to have intervention to improve food and nutrition security, among other targets and goals. So we use methods. We use the data from the World Bank Living Standard Survey. This is a panel data having 4 rounds from covering the period from 2008 to 2014. So the data is rich and nationally representative, covering almost all geographical regions in Tanzania. And we use, in the first round, we use descriptive statistics to look at the patterns, how the animal source food consumption has changed through times, and also by different geographies and by income group. And the second is we use the econometric procedure called almost ideal demand system model to estimate the price and expenditure elasticities. One important factor that informing the method here is that consumption data has a lot of zero data. So in doing estimation, we have to take into account zero consumptions and also endogeneity factors. So we use the two-step procedure developed by Schungweiler and Bien to carry out the econometric estimation. So the details I can say in follow-up slide or by separate conversation. But by now, I would like to focus on the key results here. The first one is looking at the patterns of animal source food consumptions by time and geographies. So this graph showing that animal source food consumption has changed substantially for some commodity groups like fresh fish and beef. For example, if we look into fresh fish, the consumption rate here has changed from like 40%, below 40%, up to nearly 60% over the study period 2008 to 2014. And also there's a trend of increasing consumption of beef from this period of study. But for other commodities like dry fish, we see the declining trends of household reporting consumption over the last 7 days of the preceding the survey. And for chickens, there's no pattern of change over the time. And the second here, the result here is in terms of the dollar spent on the animal source food products. So it is clear in our study the urban households spend more income on the animal source food compared to rural households. And when we look into these two specific animal source food products like fresh fish and beef, the trend is clearly shown. Like the urban households spend almost double expenditure on these two commodities compared to their rural counterparts. And another patterns when we look into some specific geographies like Zanzibar, an island in Tanzania, and then the fresh fish consumption is very high in this island compared to the rest of the country. And the similar pattern for aggregate level at animal source food. And we also see the similar things, similar patterns in Dar es Salaam, the largest city and urbanization region in the country, where the weekly expenditure on animal source food in this region is much higher than the national average. And now for the econometric estimations, the table here is showing the elasticities of animal source products with respect to its oil price and also gross price and expenditure. So at this, the last column here is the expenditure elasticity. It shows clear that chicken, first all commodity are positively respond to the expenditure. It means that when the household has more expenditure or equivalent more income, they will spend more on the animal source food. But commodity like a chicken and fresh fish has bigger responses to income or expenditure increases compared to other commodity. And when we look into the oil price elasticity, all the price negative response to the price, but chickens show the largest response. It means that it's sensitive to the price changes. And also for fresh fish, there's elasticity above 1. And for other cross price elasticity, we see some complementary and substitute effects. So I will not go into detail, but we are willing to share the result of this cross price elasticity relationship. And then this slide.
Oh, excuse me, Nuan, your time is
Yes.
up. Can you try and wrap
Okay.
up, please? Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So this slide is showing the pattern of rural and urban in terms of elasticity. So for expenditure, there's not much change, but the price is clearly showing that rural people are more sensitive to price change of the animal source products. And conclusions: animal source foods consumption in Tanzania has changed over time and geographies. We see clear changes in some commodities like fresh fish and beef. There's tendency that households consume more fish products over time. And from the study, we conclude that intervention targeting increasing household income will have the potential to improve the food and nutrition security and having positive impacts on other outcome areas. So follow-up study, we need to do further investigation on how this animal source food consumption has impacts on nutrition outcomes. Thanks, back to you, Jiga.
Great, thank you so much, Nuan, for that really fascinating study. I know many researchers are very interested in using the Living Standard Measurement Survey. So it's really very interesting to see how you applied it in this situation in Tanzania. I'm sure there's going to be some questions on the use of that. So we will now open the floor. I think we have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. There have been a couple questions that came in. The first one is from Andrew Thorn-Lyman, and it's for Constanza. I can read it, Andrew, and then if you want to unmute yourself, if you need to make any clarifications, or Constanza, you can ask Andrew to unmute himself. But it's for Constanza, and Andrew asks, while appreciating the desire to screen for rigorous evaluations, given how few randomized studies exist on aquaculture, I wonder whether screening out studies due to lack of comparison group may have excluded some information that could still have been useful. It seems like large changes in productivity, for example, even in the absence of a comparison group, could still be informative in guiding identification of technologies that hold potential, or for evaluation of subsequent trials. So, Costanza, is it clear, or would you like Andrew to clarify?
No, let me just give it a shot, and we can see if Andrew, if that satisfies the Andrew's question. So, right. So the whole point of doing the systematic review is to answer that specific question that I put on the slide, which is, what is the evidence around the effectiveness of aquaculture interventions, right? So we are specifically focusing on studies that rigorously measure the impact of aquaculture interventions on different outcomes, that we can be more confident that those changes can be attributable to this aquaculture interventions, right? Obviously, we do acknowledge that there's a wealth of other types of report, types of literature that cover the connections between aquaculture and nutrition, between aquaculture and women's empowerment, between aquaculture and production. But those would not provide sufficient or rigorous evidence to talk about effectiveness. So I think that you could still look at those studies, but to answer a different question, that is not the one that was focused on the systematic review. And for that matter, if you are interested, we have the results of those studies. If you would like to use them, at some point, that's at your disposal. But I think that the key issue here is that I think we're trying to answer different research questions.
Great, thanks, Costanza. Andrew, do you have a follow-up question or?
No, I suspected that was the case, and I appreciate that. I just think, given how young we are in terms of, you know, the body of scientific evidence, it's useful to have the conclusion that more well-designed studies need to be done. And of course, funding for those is also, would also be appreciated. But I also think, in absence of having more rigorous information, that question of what's next and where do we go from here, that could be informed by the existing, by the full body of the existing evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Costanza. Thanks, Andrew, for that great question. There's another question now for Nuong. It's from Lisa Sherburne, and apologies for my multitasking. Lisa asks, the results in Tanzania are impressive, but is there any plan to assess increased intake among women or children as a focus group, particularly, you know, the 1,000 days focus in addition to overall? And maybe while you're answering that, Nuong, you could just give us a few of the challenges related to analyzing this LSMS data.
Thanks, Gia, and thanks, Lisa Bond. Yes, the current study, we use the World Bank Living Standard Survey. So like the data form and type of data is already fixed. Like for example, they don't have intra-household dimensions. For example, when we want to look into the woman or children as disaggregate consumption, so it is difficult to figure out using this available data sets. So in this study, we have provided follow-up recommendation to look into this level of analysis by conducting primary data survey and then investigating the at the micronutrient level intakes. And currently, we also expand the study covering all the food items, not only animal source food, but all food items consumed by Tanzanian people. And hopefully by the end of this year, we will have the working paper completed for that study. And I'm sure that Tanzania is one of the focal country of a One Fish program. So in the follow-up, hopefully from the next program from 2022 to 24, the first 3 years, we will see some type of research and intervention looking at the increased nutrition, food consumption for women and children. That is, I assume that it will be a critical area that Sakuntala will push forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for that answer, and thank you for that question, Lisa. We have a question for Jacqueline, from Andrew. Jacqueline, I wonder what quantitative indicators might be used to assess how well Bangladesh's policies are being translated into action. So in addition to the key informant interviews and the perceptions of policymakers that were in your study, government funding for nutrition sensitive aquaculture, for example, and what would be the challenges to getting this type of information? So can you imagine some quantitative indicators? And if you could provide some suggestions, what would be the challenges in getting that type of information?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a great question and difficult question. I guess maybe the first thing that comes to mind is maybe a quantitative, I guess, assessment or score of the level of adoption of a certain nutrition sensitive aquaculture policy. But that would require breaking down the level of adoption, I guess. But one, and you bring up government funding for nutrition sensitive aquaculture, which I think is a good idea. But one thing also that came out of these interviews was how something like that is very much so at the national level, and that doesn't necessarily trickle down to the subnational level. So I guess your question also got me thinking of how we could really assess that more at the subnational level, where policies are being translated into action is really at the subnational level, and I don't feel like much of that is being assessed.
Great. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Andrew, for that question. We have a question for all the speakers. So I'm going to ask Kelvin to give it the first shot, and then any speaker would be welcome after. It's from Molly, and she asks, increased income due to intervention does not always lead to improved nutrition. So we know that there's not necessarily a direct pathway between income increases and nutrition improvements. So can the speakers please reflect on what are the causes for this within the context of your research, and what should programmers and designers be considering when we're designing nutrition sensitive aquaculture so that any income gains also translate to improved nutrition gains? So Kelvin, do you want to take that first, and then maybe Costanza might have an answer because your research was very related to that as part of your impact pathway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Gina, and thanks, Molly. It's a good question, and I start by acknowledging, similar to Gina, that we know that the pathway, between a nutrition-sensitive intervention and and the nutrition outcomes is one that is complicated, right? It's and so I think one of the things that come to my mind is for us not to just imagine those direct pathways, but to also consider some of the things that I would, to carefully think about the mechanisms through which such interventions, can be expected to have effects. If you, for example, you look at the presentation that Constanza was giving, one thing that comes to my mind is the need to think about how we can, understanding better the knowledge, attitude, and the practices, components. So before we can think about how those interventions actually change, things like even nutrition and incomes and etc., I think that it's important to also understand how those design interventions with a view to even influencing knowledge and people's attitudes and and ultimately practices, and then ultimately we could see if those are changing, whether that translates to improve the nutrition incomes. But I would say we need to sort of expand a little bit the set of pathways through which such causal effects could happen. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Kelvin. Costanza, would you like to give an answer to how do we translate income increases in income to increased nutrition?
So I think that Kelvin gave a very good introduction to what I was gonna mention, and I think that I would summarize this into 3 questions. First is related to what Kelvin was discussing, does the aquaculture intervention have an objective on affecting nutrition outcomes? So should we even expect, or should we even be measuring nutrition if there is no such objective? Secondly, some nutrition outcomes, we also need to think about whether we could be affecting those outcomes in the short term, in the middle term, in the long term. And sometimes, at least the reports that we saw, don't incorporate, and I'm also trying to address one of the other questions in the chat, they don't really incorporate several measurements through time. So if we are expecting aquaculture interventions to affect BMIs, is that a short-term, a longer-term relationship? And if it's a long-term, and we're only measuring short-term outcomes, for example, so there is a disconnection there between what we were expecting, what we should be measuring. this connection between maybe programming and researching. And the third point that is related to what Jackie was talking about is how to report this information so we can understand better the literature, right? So if, for example, if this quantitative indicators were standard reporting practices, it would be much easier to compare and to understand what these interventions are trying to do. So just a few, my 2 cents on this area. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Constanza, and thank you everybody for those great questions. I'm going to end the session by asking each of our speakers to give a really quick 30-second answer to this question. Given the global emphasis this year on food systems and the need for food system transformation, if you could provide one recommendation on what is needed to transform aquatic and animal source sector for better nutrition, what would that one recommendation be? And we'll go backwards in speaker order. So Nguyen, what would you, brief answer to what was your one recommendation to the UN Food System Summit to transform aquaculture and animal source foods be?
So from my experience as economist working in this sector, I see that the representation of animal source food sector in policy and decision-making process is not strong enough. So one immediate effect is that we don't have enough attention and push for prioritizing animal source food investment. So consequently, it is hard for the world to transform animal source food sector to contribute to nutrition and food security. That is clear in developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So I would like to put that policy recommendation first.
Great, thank you so much. Great idea. Next is Jacqueline. What is your top recommendation to transform aquatic and animal source foods for food systems?
Yeah, I think there has been great work in promoting diversification of production systems, and I feel like that work should continue, but also greater efforts in empowering women in the fishery sector and aquaculture sector would, I think, have a great impact on aquatic food systems.
Great. And Constanza, what would you say?
I need to push one more time on my key takeaways. I think it's very important to try to empower women, but how will we know if we're doing that? So I push one more time to try to increase the evidence base and the reporting standards on the sector to try to understand better what it's going on, what is happening, and what are the effects of these interventions.
Okay, excellent. And Kelvin, what would you say?
Yeah, I would say what is required is a very careful identification of innovation packages, and that those innovation packages are not just technological, but also should consider institutional as well as social, innovations. And then that coupled with what I think Constanza was saying in terms of either scaling those that have proven evidence and testing those that we are still not sure about their effectiveness, but look promising. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for those great suggestions for focusing more on policies and how to prioritize animal source foods and aquatic foods. I mean, I know that's hits home for those of us who have worked in the CGIAR and the focus that we often feel on staple food production, and then after staple foods comes pulses. So animal source foods hitting the radar a bit more for their important role in incomes, food security, and nutrition. And then I love diversification of food systems. I'll always be agreeing with that one. And women's empowerment. And then, of course, I like, Constanza, your idea that we really do need to get better at measuring what it is that we're trying to demonstrate the effectiveness of. And I think we will all be looking for voices to articulate those innovative packages that are going to really bring us forward. And I actually found, Kelvin, that your research was really quite innovative, because while we know that affordability is such a key to consumers' decision making, we rarely study the effects of food safety interventions and other things that help elucidate the interplay between consumer demand and consumer acceptance and desirability. So certainly consumers desire to have safe food. And I think your research showed us that they're actually also willing to pay for it. And they're not willing to accept to downgrade to less safe food. I mean, so it's just very logical, but it's really nice to see that presented in your work. So please, everyone, help me thank the speakers for their very wonderful work. And yes, and their really fantastic presentations. And I wish you a very happy rest of ANH Academy week. And I think it's back over to you, Zach.
Awesome. Thank you everyone so much for joining this session. I just have a few quick announcements that I want to push forward right now. So you should see a poll being launched just to help us at ANH Academy learn from the this remote session and continue to do better. I also want to launch a couple links in the chat. You should see some new opportunities that we have at the ANH Academy. The first being a set of teaching resources on interdisciplinarity in agriculture, nutrition, and health. And also exciting, we have a new mentoring scheme, and we're currently looking for mentors. And so if you have any interest in being a mentor for the ANH Academy and helping to connect with early career researchers, we really appreciate your attention to that link and opportunity. I think someone had already put a little, yeah, Delia had made a plug for the upcoming plenary. It's going to be really exciting. We have a lot of great panelists who will be talking about food systems evidence, priorities and power. So I think that will dovetail really nicely with some of the lessons that we took away from this session. And of course, if you want to take a look at what else we might have to offer this week, please visit our website for the full ANH 2021 program. Thanks again so much. Let us know if you have any questions, and we'll be updating our website with the slides and the recording from this session after the conference. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.